I think it is revealing to those who did not see it in that way that the European Union is essentially, and has always been, something of a political bazaar. I think one of the key elements that it is now more visible than it has been before is that the supranational norm setting goes into areas in which it should not try to venture into. The two elements that, let's say, raise eyebrows. One, that the tender was more or less tailored to an institution such as the College of Europe with the dormitory on site. And then this tender below the public threshold of transparency, those were put together to a grant of 960,000, so close to €1 million. But then for the second sum, there was a public tender, but the College of Europe already had the deal. So there was no competition on this tender because essentially it had de facto been sealed. I think it more or less says what you need to know about the current state of progressivism. Obviously, Christmas is one of the very strong traditions, and but if you want to consider it this part of the soul of Europe, but certainly part of the cultural heritage and of millions of Christians in Europe. So to deconstruct this and to neutralize this cultural and religious heritage is something which then opens doors to, in this case, the vandalism, but on a more fundamental level, it opens doors to a cultural sinking, in a way, of Europe, and that is something which diffuses into society, into politics. So it is, what we are talking about now is a symptom of something deeper.
So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. This week on the podcast, we got a lot to tackle. We're going to look at the rolling out of the EU's Asylum and Migration Pact. We're also going to take a look at a big scandal engulfing the European institutions, specifically the College of Europe. And then we're going to take a look at the horrific story of how Brussels' nativity, seen in the central square, was desecrated, vandalized by supposedly pro-Palestine protesters. We're delighted to see your comments and likes keep rolling in. As we mentioned on the podcast, really delighted that you support us. It's difficult for conservative voices to break through the algorithmic censorship that's often enforced on us. So it really makes all the difference when you watch and share this podcast and all the rest of our videos with your friends. We got some really, really exciting speeches from the Battle for the Soul of Europe conference that we're going to be releasing very soon on the channel, so stay tuned for those. Now, joining me on the podcast this week, delighted that one of our colleagues who you might have seen on our channel before once or twice is back in the studio with us, Philipp Siegert, Deputy Research Director. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
So this week we wanted to kick off with the EU's Migration and Asylum Pact. This has been in and out of the news for a while, but they finally look like they're kind of settling on some of the amounts of migrants that have to be allocated, redistributed according to the scheme, and also some of the fines are going to be imposed for people who don't go along with it. It's very ironic, actually, that they, rather than having fines, you pay a solidarity contribution, which is kind of a classic case of EU speak. But Philipp, why is the Migration Pact back in the news this week? What's actually going on?
So the thing that came up is that was negotiated is that the Council agreed for the relocation of, I think, 21,000 migrants, and for those countries that do not accept relocations, the amount of 20,000 euros, which in total amounts to a sum of 420 million for 1 year. That's in the play, if you will. And a number of Central European governments have already said and have said already before this agreement that they are not going to adhere to this decision because they have opposed it constantly, and is, for instance, for the Polish government opting out due to a rule that is part of the Migration Pact. Other countries such as Hungary and the Czech Republic have said that they're not going to apply it in any case because it's a coercion that they are not willing to accept. I think it's an example of how you can go overboard with qualified majority vote with the QMV in areas that should be unanimity decisions, and you create ever more political friction in areas and policy fields where you do not have unanimity. And instead of leaving those fields, policy fields alone, you have supranational enforcements, such as, for instance, with the Migration Pact. Now, the Migration Pact is an ensemble of 10 pieces of legislation. It's a very complex building. It has been negotiated for a decade. It has been accepted a few weeks before the elections to the European Parliament last year. So it was the last real legislative act of the European Parliament before it was reconfigured owing to the election results of 2024. There have been changes in government since then, and the political scenery is a very different one than from 2024. And that was also something that the parliamentarians were conscious of when they made this decision, was sort of the last sprint to get something through in the constellation that the European Parliament had at the time, and which was clear it would not have again after the elections of June 2024. And we see that it is something which has technically been adopted and is politically lacking the support to actually be implemented. And this is the sort of limbo that we are in, and which creates friction between a number of governments and the European Commission. It also creates controversies and frictions between various European governments. And essentially, you can see that there are Western European governments and Central European governments that have, largely speaking, opposed views on what the problem is that needs to be solved. And maybe we can also go into the one-size-fits-all mentality of European lawmaking. But obviously, if you have two sets of societies, let's say, that face two different problems, you cannot put them under one roof, be it as technical or normative as it is with the Migration Pact. And so we are heading into, I would say, a political confrontation between various governments amongst each other and the Brussels institutions, the Commission first and foremost, which is going to last way beyond, I think, June 2026, when the Migration Pact is supposed to effectively kick into force.
And it's worth kind of stepping back a second, because the Migration Pact, throughout its kind of existence, its conception and its passage, has been hailed by the European Centre and especially by von der Leyen as the solution to migration pressures, and kind of it's presented, depending on who you are, it's the solution for your problem. So if you're concerned about the scale of migration, it's said to be a tough new enforcement mechanisms and databases and all these kind of things. If you're a bit more on the left of the political spectrum, it's supposed to be about solidarity and making sure that certain countries don't feel too much of the burden and that every country does their fair share, etc. So what actually is the Migration Pact? What's it supposed to achieve?
Well, what it is supposed to achieve is to regulate the migration flow to Europe and within Europe. It does so through, as I said, 10 pieces of legislation on returns, on relocations, on border procedures. So there are various fields that are put into this Migration Pact, and there's something to the liking of every political direction and something to the disliking of every political direction. And this is, it's neither fish nor meat. I know if that's how you'd put it in English. So for instance, the left, or the progressives to be more precise, criticize it because it allows to relocate migrants whose demands have been rejected to centers that are outside the EU before they're relocated to their country of origin, if it is a safe country. And so this is what the progressives are criticizing. And then you have the relocation mechanism and the coercion that comes with it, which is criticized especially on the political right and especially from Central Europe. There is something which is dysfunctional in this pact from however direction you look at it, and there's something which is functioning in this pact from whichever direction you're looking at. But I think more fundamentally, it is this attempt to square the circle obviously comes to a solution which is not realistically to be implemented. It cannot work the way that it is designed. And for the point of Western and Central European states, so the Western European states have an integration problem. The migration is already there. The integration is the problem. The Central European states, who have had border controls for more than a decade and have enforced it since, especially during the 2015 migration crisis, but ever since then, they have a priority of keeping their societies more or less homogeneous the way that they are now. So you have two different political priorities, which you cannot possibly put under one common legislative roof. So there is something which is dysfunctional about the Migration Pact for both the Western and the central part of the European Union. And then to take the numbers that are at play right now, not even a drop on the hot stone, But it is enough to spark a controversy, and rightfully so, because if you accept the mechanism, even with a small number, obviously you have the risk of the number of 200,000 then going up to 210,000 or even larger numbers to live the solidarity amongst the European states. But it is a solidarity that the governments and the peoples in several European states do not wish to see imposed upon themselves. And it would be a very good idea to not have this attempt of a unified European approach, but to leave this to the various states and their capacity and willingness to absorb perhaps less, perhaps more than the 21,000 that are now discussed or now decided. So it's the way of looking at things from the supranational standpoint is unbefitting to the issue at hand.
And you noted that you've got a mix of countries. Poland is kind of claiming that it's exempt, but within the terms of the Migration Pact, they're saying, oh, we've already taken loads of Ukrainian refugees, so therefore we've kind of already done our bit, and there's a quid pro quo enabled there. Other countries are just saying we're not going to enforce it at all, and we just reject the whole premise. What does it say about the kind of fracturing landscape of the European Union that you have countries in open revolt against what are basically signature policies of the president of the European Commission?
I think it is revealing to those who did not see it in that way that the European Union is essentially, and has always been, something of a political bazaar. So you negotiate positions and you can put them into legal technical forms and text, and for instance, commercial matters, that's perfectly fine. And others which are more close to cultural issues or to issues of national sovereignty and public order, for instance, this is going to create much more friction and problems. And it has been this way for many years. It's just that I think one of the key elements that it is now more visible than it has been before is that the supranational norm setting goes into areas in which it should not try to venture into. And this is increasingly the case. So there is increasingly a pushback from various national institutions, also from constitutional courts. It's not just governments, and it's not just Central European governments. The German Constitutional Court is an example, but you have other entities. The French Senate is an example. So you do have pushback from parliamentarian level, from executive level, from the judiciary in the states, and this is becoming a pattern, which I think speaks in a way to the overstretch of the supranational, of the European lawmaking into areas in which it should not venture. And I don't think that the Commission is going to self-correct. I think if there is a correction of this, then it has to come from more national pushbacks. And this is something which can be, let's say, negotiated on this bazaar that the EU is. And
then zooming in on the Hungary question, because over the last few weeks, the clip and comment about Viktor Orban effectively saying, and people saying that Hungary has to pay all these fines for not taking migrants, and actually that's a really good deal because A, it keeps your society secure, B, you're not on the hook for welfare payments for migrants, and the rest of it. And in this case, then, is Hungary potentially on the hook for even more fines for rejecting the Migration Pact, or are they already baked in, or is this going to be an extra set of pressure on countries like Hungary?
It is potentially an extra pressure on countries such as Hungary. The Polish President Tusk has also announced already last year that Poland is going to apply the pact. Now they have this sort of way out for the exemption. As I said, the Czech Republic or Czechia also said we're not interested in having any part of this. So there is going to be extra pressure, but then the question comes on how to enforce this. And obviously you can fine countries, and Hungary already has this experience. I think most European countries have been fined by the Commission at some point for whatever deficiency in applying EU law they have been guilty of. So there's going to be an additional pressure in that sense, but I think it's not a pressure that is going to change the national priorities of any of those governments. It is, however, going to, in the mid and long run, going to weaken the Commission's credibility and the functionality of the EU as a whole.
Yeah, very much. I think it's increasingly seen among ordinary people and broadly across Europe that the kind of mechanism of finding people to force them to take migrants is not a winning political strategy for sure. So it's another week, another month. It means there's got to be another EU corruption scandal in brewing that's just kind of been unearthed. This in the last few weeks, we've had a few revelations related to the College of Europe, which is another one of these EU institutions that form a impenetrable web of kind of confusion for outsiders, but is not. That it's going to put more of a training ground for foreign policy diplomats and stuff rather than an official EU institution. But the head of this, a guy considered very, very influential in Brussels circles, has been caught up in a fraud investigation. And Philip, can you shed a little bit of light on what's been going on? What are the allegations, and why is this? I mean, it's like an isolated part of the broader EU apparatus, but why is it kind of caused such controversy?
So the College of Europe is indeed, in a way, its own institution, the way that, for instance, the European University Institute of Florence is. So it's not an EU body such as the Commission or Parliament or similar. But I think what makes this more controversial than you would perhaps think of an quote-unquote isolated institution is the links that Mogherini has in this case that go to the European External Action Service, and that is part of the Commission. So the controversy arose around a tender, which was the documentation of which was not public to the level that transparency would impose if you have, I think, more than 143,000 in the tender. So above that, if you have a transparency obligation and below this threshold of 143,000, there is much less of the transparency obligation. And what happened is that the European External Action Service wanted to create a diplomatic academy. And they wanted to not create it in-house, but to have another institution to create this diplomatic academy for them, and hence this idea of having a tender. But since it was below the 143,000, it was not a public tender that would have been visible to you and me and any other institution that would have been perhaps interested in creating this diplomatic academy. As far as I know, the College of Europe was aware of it. The European University Institute, together with the EU's foreign policy think tank, and a place in Madrid, I forgot the name of. They were informed about this. They applied for the tender, but one of the conditions to obtain this task of creating the diplomatic academy was to be able to house the future diplomats on your site. So, to put it short, you needed to have a dormitory, and one that's not just the typical student-like dormitory, but one that is appropriate for, not that you would have to have gold plates everywhere, but one that's appropriate for a diplomatic.
This is the European Union, after all. It has to be relatively.
Can perhaps be silver plates. But in any case, you need to be able to house people there. The year of the tender, Mogherini, at the head of the College of Europe, had signed, I think, a €3 million agreement to build housing on site of the College d'Europe, of the College of Europe. Then this tender below the public threshold of transparency came in. The college wanted, because it was the only institution that had the capacity to house the future diplomats of the European External Action Service. And then later on, a couple of months later, the European External Action Service gave an additional grant of a bit more than €650,000. And that would have, if you would have put this into one tender, it would have been 800,000 and not the 100, below the 143. So this is the two elements that, let's say, raise eyebrows. One, that the tender was more or less tailored to an institution such as the College of Europe with the dormitory on site, which was more or less tailored to what it could offer. And then this tender below the public threshold of transparency, and then add on a grant to put it to 800,000. And I think the following year, those were put together to a grant of 960,000, so close to €1 million, which is more realistically the sum that this thing costs. But then for the second sum, for the 960,000, there was a public tender, but the College of Europe already had the deal. So there were no other, there was no competition on this tender, because essentially it had de facto been sealed by the College of Europe. And this decision to keep the first tender below 143,000, to then add a grant of 650,000, and then to have in the following year a public tender of 960,000, that was a decision taken by the European External Action Service under Josep Borrell at the time.
And the College of Europe, what is it supposed to do?
Essentially, it's a university for students who want to become public servants, civil servants in EU institutions. It's not limited to that, but it is, I would say, the breeding ground of EU civil servants. It is very well connected into the European institutions. It has been created a bit on the model of the French École Nationale d'Administration, which is the main school/university that prepares civil servants for the French civil service. And on this model, the College of Europe has been created. So it is designed, it is not limited to this, but it is designed to train people to become civil servants in EU institutions. And even before the scandal now hit, it has been described by the Bruges mafia. So the college has one site in Bruges and another site in Natolin, close to Warsaw. And the Bruges Mafia is the alumni network of the College of Europe, which is a very strong one if you want to get into the European institutions. Being part of this alumni network is obviously very helpful and useful. So it is strongly connected to EU institutions, but it is essentially, perhaps you could call it an academy.
Yeah. So in many ways, it's kind of a classic. This whole story is a classic story that we're familiar with in European politics, especially in Brussels and beyond, of the kind of machinations of people making sure that their friends, political allies are kind of richly rewarded, and that the patronage networks stay intact, and that the kind of development and cultivation of young people throughout their careers is kind of carefully and tightly managed by the right kind of people and the right institutions in the EU.
So the personal web, the person's web of these institutions is very close in it. And traditionally, the head of the College of Europe is politically very influential in EU circles. So while it is an academic institution, it has very strong links to EU institutions and high-level personnel in the EU institutions.
Yeah, the familiar story for those who follow Brussels politics over the years and decades.
Small world.
And then finally, coming to a story that I wanted to cover a couple of times on the podcast, but we had kind of breaking news that we needed to cover. And this is a story topical of the time of year, but also I think very revealing of the way things are going. And this is the story of the nativity scene at the Grand Place in the center of the historic center of the city of Brussels. Every year there's a nativity scene set out. There's a rather disappointing Christmas tree, all decorated, and there's the nativity scene with the Holy Family and the baby Jesus in the crib and the animals and the shepherds and all the rest of it. And this year it was quite an interesting choice to begin with. Can you first? We'll go into what happened more recently, but they made a strange decision in terms of how they were going to create this nativity scene to begin with. What was that?
So the decision was to have the figures that stand in the crib not have human faces, but to make them more abstract. And the artist that was Miss Gaia, that was chosen for this task, designed figurines in the crib that have used cloth as face. Looks a bit like a piece of rug. And so you had the Holy...
Why?
Yeah, so the Holy Family had, including Jesus, had no recognizable face. And the argument was made, so there was a small and a large argument. The small argument came from the Burgmeister of Brussels, who said, yeah, well, for 25 years we've had the same figurines and they need a break, essentially, and they are not as mint as they used to be 25 years ago. So something new. And this something new was supposed to be more inclusive. And this more inclusive came in the form of defaced figurines, and instead you had these used cloth used as heads of the figurines. And the argument was that it is something which is more... Yeah, I think the artist said that the people who look at this can more easily identify with the nativity scene because it does not exclude them by the way the face looks or by the skin color or the hair color or I don't know what. So that is the inclusivity argument was the one that was presented as the main driver for this decision.
While not the official narrative, I mean, people immediately were drawing the connection that in Islam, showing the faces of religious figures is strictly prohibited. In Brussels, as a kind of very vocal Islamic or even Islamist kind of component to the city. Plenty of stories have been around that. So people immediately drawing the maybe subtextual connection that the inclusivity in question meant being slightly less Christian and being more amenable to Islam.
Well, I think that is a fair argument to make. It's not the public argument, obviously, but I think it is at least part of the consideration. And certainly can say is that it is less Christian than having and it's also the Christmas market is frequently referred to as the winter market. So I mean, this trend is also part of how the nativity scene was designed. So yes, inclusivity in a way means neutralization of Christian heritage, even in the nativity scene on the Christmas market.
Yeah. And then something happened in the last couple of weeks, which kind of really added insult to injury here. What happened next?
Next thing that happened, so controversy started. Next thing that happened is that the head of the baby Jesus figurine was stolen. And shortly after that, the tent in which they are placed was tagged with Free Palestine. And so you had double vandalism essentially on the nativity scene. And this has then also created a public outcry. And you had a really large demonstration, also Free Palestine demonstration, I think on the day that the Christmas market officially opened, which meant that you could not really get to the Christmas market. You had scenes of clashes with the police. And so that was quite an unworthy beginning of the Christmas market in several regards.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen a few of these supposedly pro-Palestine marches coincidentally taking place in major squares where Christmas markets are held over in various countries. I know there have been a couple in Germany, for example. There have been here in Brussels and I think in the Netherlands as well. So there's a bit of a theme. Number one, we got this attack, desecration, if you like, of the nativity scene in Brussels. We had a big conference about the Soul of Europe. A lot of people were lamenting the fact one of the parts of the soul of Europe, the kind of Christian heritage, is very much under attack, and Christians feel on the defensive. What do you think this says about the kind of status of Christmas, this kind of central part of our heritage?
I think it more or less says what you need to know about the current state of progressivism in the West. I think the best description that I can come up with is to describe it as radical deconstructivism. So whatever is heritage is, especially from the woke side, considered to be inherently bad, if not evil. So it has to be neutralized, abandoned, in a way atoned for from their point of view. And obviously Christmas is one of the very strong traditions and part, if you want to consider it this part of the soul of Europe, but certainly part of the cultural heritage and of millions of Christians in Europe and across the world, obviously. So to deconstruct this and to neutralize this cultural and religious heritage is something which then opens doors to, in this case, the vandalism, but on a more fundamental level, it opens doors to a cultural sinking, in a way, of Europe, and that is something which diffuses into society, into politics. So it is. What we are talking about now is a symptom of something deeper going on that we've been commenting on and repeated in podcasts and conferences that we've organized. So in a way, this is the sort of the season of the year, the topical symptom of this, and a particularly scandalous one. It is something that I think we're going to see again for Easter or for other major cultural and religious events. And the combination of progressive deconstructivism and politically driven Islamism is something which is a continuous problem in Brussels, perhaps particularly, but it's certainly not limited to Brussels.
Yeah, this lack of confidence in the classical values of Western or European civilization nations in Europe is a huge problem, one that we're going to continue to tackle with various topics and conferences in the new year. But for now, that's it for us on the MCC Brussels podcast. Next week, tune in we'll have a bumper edition, a Christmas special, if you like, where we'll review some of the big stories from the year. So make sure you tune in for that. But for now, it's left to me to say thanks so much, Philipp, for joining us. It's been a delight to have you on.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time on the MCC Brussels podcast.